Hello.
Hey, how are you, Richard?
Very well. How are you?
Great, thank you. Did you get the email that we just had to run over a couple of minutes with the last?
Yeah, no worries. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to go and pop us live into Facebook. So that just takes a minute or so while it synchronizes and goes live there. Where are you coming in from?
I'm in a co-working space in Hong Kong.
Oh, beautiful, in Hong Kong right now.
Yeah.
Can you possibly get a little closer to your mic or something? Because it does sound a little distant.
It's here. Is that better?
That's a little better, yeah.
Okay. Don't quite know how I'm going to.
Got a bit of that.
Yeah, I left my mic at home this morning, which was because my wife was having a fight with my daughter, and I forgot it. So I'm borrowing somebody else's.
You need one of these. Yeah, that's good. It's just a little tiny bit soft, so that's all right. I'll try and amend as much as I can. They send for that. So we're just still connecting to Facebook, so let's just give that a minute. So yeah, we're streaming every day into our Facebook group as well. So anyone who's joining already, if you want to watch along in the Facebook group, it's called the Superhuman Summit. The Superhuman Summit. You need the in front of it. And it's been great seeing the interaction and the conversations that have been happening there. Yet we're now live on Facebook. Hello to the attendees just starting to come in. Hello, Simon, Tim, Michael, Martha, Karen, all of you coming in. And we're 1 minute after the hour, but we just might wait for a minute or two if that's all right with you, Richard, while people finish hopping on board. Excellent. And we just had people from all around the world, which is what's lovely about this technology, isn't it, these days, what we can do. Hello, Tim. So we just literally had people from Bahrain, Egypt, Bangkok, the Philippines, London. It was fabulous. So perhaps if you can pop in the chat box, anyone who's joining now, where you're coming in from. Where are you around the world? What city are you in right now? And perhaps if you can also pop in the chat box for us. Hello, Richard, a link to your website or LinkedIn or however you prefer people to contact you with you. Birmingham in Alabama. Hello, Hong Kong, Birmingham. Simon in Sydney. So please pop in where you're from. If you're on the Facebook group as well, I'll be monitoring that throughout. So please tell me where you're coming from if you're there as well. It would be great to see where you're all coming in from as well. Brilliant. Karen in Melbourne. Oh, thanks for that, Richard. So yeah, please do reach out and connect with Richard. And myself and Michelle, who are the founders of Human Power, who are running this summit. You can also connect with us. And we're both on LinkedIn as well. So Michelle is Michelle Crawford and I'm AJ Alexandria Joy. I think my name at the moment says that I'm Michelle and AJ. I have a bit of an identity crisis when I'm here in Zoom because we're sharing it for everything. Let me just... That's me, Alexandria Joy. Hello, Anne. Hello, Anne. I saw you were on a presentation yesterday. Great to see you back in here again. I hope you're getting great value from the summit. So without further ado, let's get underway. Welcome back for those of you who are jumping in and out throughout the summit, because that's how we've liked it to be, so that people can... Richard, I just need to change your link. I think it was only viewable to me. So let me just pop that in here. Great, there's Richard's LinkedIn account for everyone. For those of you who are just joining now, the summit, this is our second day, and thank you, Richard, you are our final speaker for today, for day 2, which has been quite epic. It's been amazing. We've had so many amazing speakers already, And we still have just over another 30 to go over the coming 6 days. So please feel free to tune in. We've got people on Facebook saying, hey, Richard, nice to meet you, or meet you. So Kerry and Michelle are already hopping on there. We've got a lot of people starting to roll in here. The summit, as we've said, is Michelle and Mai's gift to humanity. We believe in the global goals. We believe in building community. And we think during this time in COVID, more than ever, when we can't get out and travel and go to conferences and see speakers and be connecting with each other physically, that we can still do this online, and we can still hear from thought leaders and amazing people such as the gentleman that you see in front of you right now. And so Richard has got a really interesting topic, and I think some people were very intrigued about the title of your topic today, Richard, the death of the birth of the Avengers. Now, Richard is the CEO of a company called Round Pegs, which is a community of disruptive thinkers and rebel talents. Does it get any better than that? I'm just saying. And they're all about employing the science of work, the art of community, and the incubation of ideas to help leaders and companies cope with the black swans of the VUCA world. And that's all about that volatility, uncertainty, which is kind of more and more becoming the norm. And VUCA, I think, used to be a term that was used a lot in military, wasn't it, Richard? But now seems to be adopted by so much of us around the world in business as well. He has an MBA module on the future of leadership from Macquarie Business School. And yeah, he's just, I guess, a leader in so many ways and in so many topics, and a fascinating one today. Perhaps I can hand straight over to you to share a bit about your topic today. And towards the end, if it's all right with you, if we can jump in and answer any Q&As that might come, or even throughout, if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got a slide presentation, but I can talk straight to the screen, or I can share slides. I don't. What's better for you guys?
Slides is fine, and we can jump in and out of that as we need to.
Okay, cool.
And in Facebook, they'll still see you and your slides together. Yeah. So you should be able to share your screen.
See if I can share that, and then if I put that on present.
Beautiful.
Working. Okay, so first of all, to anyone, I have had to fit writing this presentation into thousands of other hours of work around my work from home stuff that I've been inundated in. So not too many fancy graphics, I'm afraid. So my superpower is definitely not making fancy graphics at speed. But hopefully it'll do. So I think anyone who's actually seen me before, most of the time I just do black and white presentations, and I hope that the talking counters the lack of ability to put fancy graphics in. So this comes in two halves. The first half I'm going to talk about the death of Superman, and the second half, the birth of the Avengers. So here's one of my few graphic slides, which is from the Death of Superman comic, where Superman actually dies. I think he's been comforted by, or being cradled by, Lois Lane here. And this was sort of, the reason this theme came about is a bunch of work I've been doing with a leadership startup group, or leadership development startup group, calling themselves Prometheus, or the Prometheus Project. And that we sort of, when we're talking about how do we develop leaders, this was the way that we sort of said the popular consciousness already understands that a super leader in their Superman mode doesn't necessarily exist. But actually the birth of the Avengers, the super leaders in the Avengers mode perhaps does exist. That more team-based, come together to deal with complex challenge stuff works. So really that's the overall framing of what I'm going to be talking about. And to an extent, this would be a step beyond the MBA stuff that I teach. So the future of leadership, this would be the next kind of thing that I would want to talk about if you've done one of those kind of courses. So the first sort of, after this wonderful picture that I spent hours searching Google for, really we're looking at the idea that over the last 100 odd years, in fact, perhaps throughout leadership studies, so back for the last 150 years, there's been an idea that leaders have become our supermen. And I actually want to start sort of interrogating this idea with a quote from Kill Bill, of all films. And this is a quote from Kill Bill, and it's around the idea that Superman didn't become Superman, he was always Superman. When he wakes up in the morning, he is Superman, and his alter ego is Clark Kent. So this is unusual in superheroes, is that he doesn't put on a mask to hide his real identity. His real identity is the hero, and Clark Kent is the alter ego. It's the opposite way around from most superheroes. And the argument made in Kill Bill is that Clark Kent is how Superman views the rest of the human race, and the characteristics of Clark Kent: weak, insecure, cowardly. And in Kill Bill, and you don't have to agree with this, but in Kill Bill, Quentin Tarantino argues that Clark Kent is Superman's critique on the whole human race. So we've got this superhuman powered creature in our midst, and his view of humanity is we're weak, we're unsure, and we're cowardly. And that's sort of the framing of when we go into a certain form of leadership studies. That's an interesting frame to start from. We're looking at the idea that the super leader, or the leader, or the superhero leader is somehow different from the rest of us. And being different from the rest of us is not necessarily the way that we should perceive leaders, but we have done. There's a certain discourse that follows this idea. And the first part of the discourse is Carlyle's discourse in 1841, and he talks about heroic leaders. And this is the idea of the great man theory, it's been called, which has become quite popular again in recent years. And it's the idea that genius is not about getting lots of brains together. It's not about compounding talent and getting lots of lesser talents together to work as a collaborative group. That you can't create a Napoleon out of that. You can't create a Shakespeare, and you can't create an Einstein. That actually these geniuses have been individual talents that have stood apart from humanity and are quite often dragged back by humanity. So we're seeing this in popular discourse and largely through the work of Dr. Jordan Peterson, who, you know, he's someone who provoked great emotions in people. So his basic argument is that potentially great people are being brought down by the tyranny of equality of outcome. And this is a really important argument that he talks about. So he says, basically, everybody should be given equality of opportunity. That if you give everybody the access to the potential to become great from the day they're born, then you might end up with a huge number of heroic leaders because you've given them the opportunity to realize themselves, to become self-actualizing, self-transforming humans. However, where he argues, what he argues is wrong, is the equality of outcome. If you ensure all positions are filled equally by requisitely diverse identity groups, you actually harm the possibility of these heroic people rising above the masses and taking control and power. So this is an argument that really was started in 1841 by Thomas Carlyle, and it's as I said, it's resurfacing in our discourse at the moment, and Jordan Peterson would be one of the people who've resurfaced it. I don't necessarily agree with this. I think that leaders stand on the shoulders of giants and actually they don't stand separately from society. But it's an important thing that this is a way that we've been thinking about leadership since 1841. So we're talking about 180 years worth of thinking about this type of leadership.
We've just had someone in the Facebook group ask, who do you think is a standout leader at the moment? Or is that then going against what you believe?
I think I can talk to that as we go through. I don't like to. So the leaders in the public face of leadership, yes, you've got people who are doing well at the moment and who are doing badly at the moment. One of the leaders that I'm quite interested in are the ones who aren't necessarily so obviously charismatic, and I'll sort of get to that because they're not the ones that are seen, but they're doing really good jobs. So as I go through, I'll look at that. So which sort of takes me to the next slide. So it's the idea of the charismatic leader. So this is Max Weber from 1922. It was translated into English in 1947, but it's an old idea. And this is the idea that really these supernatural and superhuman powers or qualities, the qualities of the individual personality, which separate these heroic types from ordinary people, it really is around the idea of charisma. It's persuading people to follow. And ordinary people don't have charisma. And Weber argues it's sort of almost seen as being divine origin or an exemplary trait. And because the leader has these exemplary traits, the basis of them, they're treated as a leader just because of these charismatic traits that sort of persuade people to follow them. And then we've got sort of the reason I didn't want to sort of suggest that we can see leaders from the public charisma is we've got two different challenges that when we just base leadership on charisma. Now, it doesn't mean because you're charismatic that you're not necessarily a good leader. You could be a great leader and charismatic, but you could also be a great leader and not very charismatic. But the problem is we're beginning to see personality cults. The more we rely on charisma as a mark of leadership potential, the more we risk with ending up with toxic leaders who use their charms and influence to grab power and manipulate their followers. So it doesn't mean it's not a quality of leadership, but if we amplify it as being the main quality of leadership, then we have potential for bad leaders, etc. And Thomas Chamorro-Premuzic, who works for Hogan and is a brilliant writer and presenter, he talks about the charismatic incompetence, that actually people are more likely to tolerate a bad performer who is charismatic than a high performer who is not, and are much more likely to promote them because that charisma is what we're talking about. So again, we've got 100 years worth of research on charisma as a marker of leadership potential. And something that we still look for, you know, and that's why I wasn't necessarily ready to answer that question, because we look publicly as the charismatic people that we see. That doesn't necessarily mean they're good leaders. So Chamorro-Premuzic talks about the CEO of IKEA as a non-charismatic yet great leader. I've lost the other company now. My head's gone blank. It'll come back to me. Some
people also say, some say D. Hock from Visa as well.
Yep,
wasn't necessarily, you know, a charismatic leader, but had good leadership qualities. So in a way, I'm hearing that people could be promoted to their own level of incompetence that we often hear, but for the reasons of charisma.
Yes.
And I guess the scary thing in our world when we are in social media and have so much leverage through social channels is that the charismatic leader can have even more influence and a bigger voice in a way in modern times, can't they?
Absolutely. Yeah, so the other leader who's, I forgot for a second, is the CEO of Zara, who is so hidden from view, I can't remember his name. And I could barely remember which company I was talking about, but has done incredible work in the fashion industry and a world leading company by doing the opposite of what most other companies do. So he's another perfect example of what good leadership sort of looks like without charisma interrupting it. So charisma, right. It's something to be aware of. So you've got this idea from both the previous two slides, the heroic leaders from Carlyle and the charismatic leaders from Weber. You've got the idea that the leader is somehow superhuman, that there's something divine about them and the origins. And that sort of then goes into Burns's work in the late 1970s about the transformational leader. And as you can see in this slide, every single time a follower is mentioned, I have underlined it. Because the first 2 points here, the idealized influence, the role model, walking the talk, the inspiration, the motivation, the visionary aspect, this is just charisma again. It's just a more scientific way of examining charisma. You're breaking it down into two informing components. So the transformational leader, which in most academic circles is still seen as the ideal leader. You still hear a lot of academic research looking at this as being sort of the perfect leader or the best leadership model. It's still underpinned, at least 50% of the work is underpinned by the notion of charisma. And then the other two, you've got the individualized consideration, so concern for the needs and feelings of the followers, and then helping them self-actualize, helping them become more than they actually are, helping them grow, helping them develop. And intellectual stimulation encourage them to be innovative and creative and to change the status quo, which really is just psychological safety. I mean, it's creating a psychological safe environment to be collective intelligence. That's intellectual stimulation and enabling voice. And then the consideration is around learning and development and helping people grow. What I find with lots of transformational leaders, and lots of them can do the top bit, the charisma, it gets in the way, and where the incompetence happens is the bottom bits. They don't enable the personal growth, they don't create psychological safety, so it's become a sort of a top heavy, and I don't like talking about transformational leadership as a perfected or idealized model of leadership, because I think it is top heavy and charisma gets in the way. I actually like the bottom half a lot more than I like the top half. And I think the inspirational motivation and the vision is interesting, because there's supposed to be this stability of vision. So the idea when Burns was writing it, here's your vision for the future strategically in 5 years' time, we're going to get the company to here. But today, a 5-year vision, the world will have changed so much by the time you've gone 5 years down the road. The vision is almost irrelevant by then. A perfect example was IBM's attempt to create Lotus Notes to work on the 386 computer. By the time they did it, which took 2 years, the 386 computer was obsolete. So you've got, there's got to be something else than that stability. And so we've been looking for stability in leadership for I think, because we know that it isn't working. This strong, stable, perfect leader, this strong vision, we know it's not working, so we're looking for a different form of stability. And I think that is authentic leadership. So Bill George's work, which started in 2003 with his book Authentic Leadership, and then again he wrote True North. And there's 4 different components. So the first one, which is great, is self-awareness. Know your strengths and weaknesses, understanding the self is multifaceted and multi-layered, learn about how you impact other people, continuous self-exposure and development process. So you've got learning and development, you've got self-actualizing, you've got reflection, you've got emotional intelligence, all of the things that relate to self-awareness. You then got an internalized moral perspective. So you understand business ethics, you understand fairness, and they inform all your decision making, and you sort of impose your self-imposed self-regulatory behavior based on your moral values. So you look inwards to find out what your own moral compass is, and then you use that to inform your interactions with others. The other 2, balanced processing. So we can see here again the sort of stuff coming out of transformational leadership: openness and fairness, create an environment where opinions are welcome and encouraged, exchange and opposing viewpoints, get voice. So you've got all the psychological safety stuff and the collection intelligence there. And then relational transparency, so no politics, no hidden agendas, no mind games, create an environment where everyone knows where they stand in terms of relationship with the leaders. And what authenticity, or the philosophy of authenticity, comes from the notion that it sort of imposed social values, or the standard organizational values, are generally quite absurd. So you have to look inwards to find out where your values lie. And out of that inward looking authenticity, then you become more ethical, then you become more powerful, etc. So the most interesting sentence I think has been written around authentic leadership was in Jeffrey Pfeffer's Leadership BS book. So he said, look, I read Bill George's book, and that's not the Bill George I knew. So how he talks about himself, and again, it's this idealized superheroic figure that is self-presented by Bill George. So how he talks about himself is not necessarily how he was. So that your own internal heroic narrative, and we all have heroic narratives because we don't want to be the villains of our own story, isn't necessarily the truth of what went on.
And so in a way, this authentic leadership is an idealized thing,
absolutely.
And it sounds a lot like level-headed, high emotional intelligence, fair, no hidden agendas, mind games means, speaking truth-telling, transparent communication. And it does sound very ideal. And yes, there are leaders we could point to who have some of these traits, but it's quite a high bar.
Yeah, it's a big ask, and again, it seems to be beyond most of us. We all hope that we can do this, but actually, can we do it? I think this is the themes that I'll be going into as we go on. So they're
and even does that need to be packaged in one leader? Yeah, and during times like this with COVID, we're seeing, you know, certain leaders step forward and really shine. We're seeing others really make some balls up of the situation. And in some ways, when you look at politics and some of the government and the decisions they're making, it's not always one person, it's a team. So could you have, you know, a high IQ and a high EQ person, someone with great relational transparency and someone with balanced processing working together to give great leadership, perhaps of a country or a company, or
So I think you're preempting what I'm going to talk about, which is great.
Sorry.
But that's fine. No, that's fine, because that's how you should be reading this. That this is something that's so difficult to get to that is actually is in a model that we should be that we should be promoting anyway, as in terms of what a good leader looks like. So here again, here's Bill George's sort of model of, you know, your lifespan of becoming a leader. So, you know, ages of up to 30, you're preparing for leadership. You then have this sort of dip as you step up to lead, where you recognize it's much harder. And then sort of between the ages of 50, 60 or so, you're at peak leadership, and then you give back. So at the end of 90, you've sort of lived your fully authentic life, and it's been wonderful. Similarly, this is Robert Keegan's work. So he talks about, okay, how at different ages and different development state phases, and you can see the similarity between, what Bill George did, his life journey, and Keegan's life journey. So Keegan argues that, you know, eventually certain people will get to the self-transforming mind level of life. And the self-transforming mind is where great leadership lies. But unfortunately, only 1% of people he studied get there. You can look at Jim Collins' work on Good to Great, and I think in Jim Collins' work, 14 out of 12,000 leaders had got there. So again, we're looking at this being a superhuman model that we can't, you know, if you train 100 people, one's going to get there.
Very similar to David Hawkins as well, with his scale of consciousness. And he talked about, you know, 0 to 1,000, that only maybe 3 or 4 humans currently would be over 600.
Yes. Yeah. But yet this is how we're sort of perceiving development processes. And sort of how do we get people there? So if it takes you, if you give me 100 people and I can get one there, and if it will take me 20 years to get them there, we have a bit of a challenge. So that's sort of which takes me to the next slide. A lifelong journey in today's world. You're having a laugh, mate. Do we need leaders now? And this is the big challenge: is that as our current leadership development models take too long to get people up to the level in which they're going to lead. Very few people get there, and we end up with people like these leading big companies. So Travis Kalanick, Elizabeth Holmes, and Adam Newman. Who have, you know, they've caused a fair bit of damage. None of them have made any money yet. They've become, well, 2 of them potentially become quite rich, but they're stripping value from investment still, all of them. And Elizabeth Holmes is potentially going to go to prison. I'm not sure whether she did or not, but I mean, it was a con. So when we look at the leadership development dysfunction, so I think this was last year I did this research, but it was an estimated 122 billion spent with a 7 to 14% success rate. So the 7% is the number of young leaders or the number of organizations who are confident that they can produce millennial leaders in their organizations, 7%. 14% is the number of companies who have got a good succession plan in place. So they've got people on the bench. So that's 93% of companies that can't produce young leaders, can't develop young leaders, and 86% of companies that don't have anyone on the bench. So this gives you a challenge based on this sort of formal developmental model, and I'm going to go through why I think it's problematic. So first of all, I already said it's very expensive. It's quite outdated. Unfortunately, a lot of it's infected by charlatans. I mean, leadership development is one of the most charlatan-infected fields out there, which I'll sort of get to as well. Hugely poorly regulated. There's all kinds of people who are involved in this who have got no reason or no ability to be part of it.
Yeah, well, it's a deregulated kind of market, isn't it? So anyone can bring a shingle out and say, I'm a leadership consultant, and have never led in their life.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think you've got 2 things. You've either done it or you've researched it.
Yes.
Yeah, and if you've done
but
it,
many have done
neither. Many of most, I think, have done neither. From when I look at the market, so it takes too long. It even fails to properly identify high potentials or evaluate their readiness to lead. It tends to look at high performance and just assume that that equals potential to leadership and readiness to lead, and it doesn't. It's a completely different set of concepts. Very few people reach a well-rounded graduation level where so that 1% where they're good at everything. 1%, if we're lucky. And for me, it adds, this is the biggest challenge, it adds more cognitive complexity and emotional intensity to an already overwhelming workload. So if you're trying to be developing a leader, plus all the other work you have to do, the chances are you're going to totally, utterly burn out rather than develop as a leader. Which I think we're seeing more and more of. So that for me is a developmental dysfunction that overviews the leadership, much of the leadership development industry. Not all of it. There's some really good stuff out there, but much of it. So the output of that dysfunction, so huge money and time costs, no guaranteed outcome. And I think we get well-rounded mediocrities if we're lucky. So basically what happens is lots of people who are developing as leader have to gain competencies in things they're not very good at, and spend loads of time working on that and not enough time working on the stuff they're talented at. So they end up not being particularly talented at the stuff they were talented at and average at the stuff they're good at. So they become a well-rounded mediocrity rather than somebody who understands part of the world incredibly well and is aware of their own weaknesses and what they're not good at. But they love what they do and they can access what they do in the right environment, that offers a huge amount of value. So I think that's if we're lucky. I think if we're not lucky, we get nihilistic ennui if we're not, in that there's no purpose, there's no motivation, there's no satisfaction, there's no passion. We're just going through the motions. And especially if you've got young kids, especially in Asia, and they're no good at maths and they're great at art, well, that poor kid is going to spend 15 hours a week tutoring maths. And how are they ever going to become passionate and motivated? And you look at that kid, because it's easiest to look at that as a metaphor, and then just apply that to leadership development. You end up spending all the time on stuff you're not passionate about, and then you're expected to lead. So that for me is where we've got to, this sort of idea that Superman is what we're aiming at. And we need to kill that idea, that if only 1% of us get there, and actually if Collins is right, it's 0.1%. It's a ridiculous model to follow. So what actually do we do? And this is why I come into the Avengers model, because we already know this at a popular consciousness level. There's a reason that Superman films do badly now. They did well in the 80s, they do badly now, because Superman is boring. We can't relate to him. He can just do everything. All Superman needs to turn up. He just needs to turn up and then everything's fine. So I don't know if you saw the Justice League film, but that's what happened. The whole Justice League film was waking Superman up, sort of bringing him back from the death. And once he turns up, he just destroys the enemy. So you just had to get him. Whereas the Avengers, we already know that pretty much every character in the Avengers is flawed. They can solve some problems by themselves, but when it becomes a world's level problem, they have to come together as a team. And then they have to cover, so the team enables each other's strengths and the team covers for each other's flaws. So what I want to then look at is, this is a much more understandable picture of a leader. So you don't just do the strength finding and sort of go, here are your strengths, forget your weaknesses. You do, here are your spikes of strength, but here are your spikes of weaknesses. And you need to be totally and utterly aware of both. And you need not to try and pretend that you've got strength where it's a weakness, and rely on someone else to cover for it. So let's just sort of go through the character types. So here's a bunch of Avengers. So Tony Stark, or Iron Man, he's brash. In the beginning of the Iron Man films, brash, egotistical, heavy drinker. Incredible inventor, loads, incredibly intelligent and imaginative, but he has all these weaknesses. Bruce Banner, the Hulk, anger, violence, and a lack of purpose. Can't see a future for himself. Steve Rogers, or Captain America, he's naive, idealism, melancholy, and stubbornness. Peter Parker, or Spider-Man, fear of responsibility, mood swings, and immaturity. Natasha Romanoff, lack of trust, manipulative and poor self-worth, and Thor, rage, lack of self-worth and recklessness. So they've all got these character flaws. And so the mask is sort of a way of hiding, whereas Superman, the mask is to add character flaws. With these guys, the masks they put on is to hide the character flaws. So when they play the superhero role, they're trying to cover for all of these non-heroic aspects of their existence. And they try and wear a mask, and then they try and live up to that mask. And as the team comes together, the team tries to help everybody live up to that mask, rather than sort of you're a perfect human being. But none of them are perfect. And that's why they're more interesting. And that's why, for me, one of the we can identify with character types like this. And this is not a new concept. So the actual original concept is Hamartia, the hero's fatal character flaw. And you look, Achilles and Odysseus had hubris, Theseus, impulsiveness and recklessness, Oedipus, hastiness, overtrust in his intellect, Dr. Faustus, lust for certainty, Hamlet, procrastination, overthinking, Macbeth, blind ambition, unreflective loyalty. So we've got the ancient Greeks, and then the sort of the classic British period where they were really examining, and the German Romantic period, where they were really examining human character types at a very deep level. They all had fatal flaws. Every hero had fatal flaws. The interesting ones he always had the fact that they were coping with their weaknesses the best that they could. So this is not a new thing. So unlike that sort of the stuff I showed earlier, this scientific modeling of the heroic leader, actual drama and literature and this kind of stuff has always understood that leadership involves dealing with the full human, and the full human has flaws and weaknesses. And the problem is, and so this slide I've been thinking, should I keep it in? Should I take it out? Should I keep it in? Should I take it out? Because it's a difficult one to describe, but it really looks at where we've got to in leadership studies. So this is an ancient, and by ancient I think 1986, organisational studies argument by Carlyle, and it's applied to leadership studies. So basically Wyke argues that research on organisations, but I've changed it to research on leadership. Research and leadership can be generalizable, accurate, or simple. Now, if you try to be generalizable and accurate, you can't be simple. So the really good leadership theory, so I've put a list of names here, Heifetz, Torbert, Grint, and Jacques, as doing really complex, generalizable, and really accurate leadership theory. You can't be simple. It's inaccessible, and it's overdetermined. So it's so difficult to get to read. And I'll go further. I've got an example of this as we go on. If you try to be accurate and simple, you can't be generalizable. So lots of people get into leadership studies by reading case studies if you've gone to university and MBAs. When I teach my MBA, I refuse to use case studies. I don't think they're helpful when it comes to leadership because they're just one single context and you're going to be leading in a completely different context. And biographies, you read a biography of a leader, so almost that's what Bill George's work is. It's a biography of his own leadership, and it's obviously coloured by his own interpretation of what he did. But you can't be generalisable. This is somebody leading in a specific example or a specific life, and you can't take stuff out of that one example and generalise it across to everything. If you try to be generalisable and simple, you can't be accurate. So for me, the populist books such as Simon Sinek's Start With Why and Simplified Personality Theories. Now, while they're interesting gateways into studies of leadership, you can see them as a gateway drug, and perhaps as well, the case studies of biographies, a gateway drug to get you into the generalizable and accurate theories. If you just read that one book and say, right, that's what leadership looks like, the chances are you're going to cause more harm than good. It doesn't mean you shouldn't read them. It just means you have to accept that they're starting points. And if you try and generalize a non-accurate theory, you've got a problem. If you try and generalize an accurate yet simple theory, then you've also got a problem.
And we've got lots of people in the chat group in Facebook saying that they love this perspective. Some of them are saying heroes need to start saving themselves. But lots of people are liking the perspective and loving how every human has superhuman skills, but also superhuman weaknesses, and that we're all human. And I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, that's what makes it
talk
human.
about people have pointy bits like stars, and we try and make them too well-rounded, which means we kind of cut off the pointy bits that made them great in the beginning. So loving where this is going with the idea of needing the whole team of Avengers.
Yes. So yeah, and again, my last point here is if you try and say all three, you're not saying anything. So you can't actually write generalizable, accurate, and simple. It's impossible. Because as soon as you get into the complex levels of leadership, you're no longer simple. I mean, it's just an impossible thing to do. So if you're trying to write that kind of work, maybe it sells, but it's not going to be any use to anybody. So this is the side. I wasn't sure whether to put this one in or not, but it really frames. If you look at everything you've read and studied around leadership, you can put it in this framework and say, well, where does it fit?
Yes.
And the aim is you're trying to move up to at least generalizable and accurate stuff, or having read some of it. So I'm going to show you some of what that looks like, which is why it becomes sort of problematic. So this is my generalizable, and there's two of them. I haven't put all four in, but two. And if you actually look at this language here, this is not the language of leadership. It's not the language of organizations, because they're having to create their own language in order to try and explain the concepts they're seeing. So some of them are obvious, but others are far less obvious. So, you know, Heifetz talks of technical and adaptive challenges. I think most people will sort of understand the difference, but even that has been only maybe the last 10 years where that's become more commonplace in organizational language. You've got holding environments in the productive zone of tension. Now, for me, unless you've read Heifetz, that's totally alien to you. So it's, in essence, it's the idea that the leader is trying to create an environment where you're not overwhelmed by the stress, but you're not bored because it's too easy for you. So there's a productive level of tension where the whole group or community comes together to solve the problem in a collective way. And the leader's job is to try and make sure that nobody escapes that zone, which is work avoidance. How do I get out? If it becomes too frustrating, how do I avoid doing the work? If it becomes too overwhelming, how do I avoid doing the work? So the leader's job is to constantly, and again, it goes back to the idea of self-actualizing. How do I get everybody performing to the best of their ability in a collective way in these holding environments and productive zones of tension? So again, psychological safety, I've talked about it a few times. It relates to that. How do you get them all talking to each other and feeling safe enough to say what they're thinking? You've got the idea that the role of authority in the exercise of leadership is different. Just because you're in a position of authority doesn't mean you're exercising leadership. You're definitely exercising power, but you're not necessarily doing the activity of leadership. And then lots of people have sort of seen the idea of the balcony and the dance floor. The leader has to be on the balcony, watching the dance, and then also in the dance. But really, that's reflection in action. And again, that's a term that's not common in most organizations. Torbert's model, action inquiry model, which again, you know, most people don't use that kind of language. And he's got 8 different levels. So the top 1, 2, 3, 4 are sort of low-level leadership, where the opportunist is really quite a dysfunctional leader, up to the achiever. You get, and again, I've got the percentages of people who get to these roles. So this is this step-based stuff that we've looked at. How do you get people up to that 1%? And his top 2 levels of leaders are alchemists and Eironists. So again, I challenge, unless you've read Torbert's stuff, I challenge any organization to say, well, okay, he's a potential alchemist leader. It's not language that's part of the everyday life. And this is why it's generalizable and accurate, and it's also overdetermined, and it's also complex, because you read Alchemist, and then you have to read 2 chapters of work explaining what actually an alchemist does and the procedures and the concepts that it informs that one word. So really interesting stuff, but it's not commonplace. And also, as you know, 2% of people ever get to alchemist level, and Ironist, which is the highest level, less than 1%. And you only ever see it in glimpses. So this ultra high level theorized leadership, they never see anyone perform like that all the time. There's just glimpses of these kind of performances. So I don't want to go into too much about this because it gets too complex. Go and read the book if you're interested in these models. They're quite fascinating. So the next one is Ron Warren's work. So again, on the left, this is his book cover. personality at work. And you can actually see, we've already seen this graph of building up towards a sort of a high-level leader. But what he's done in his draft, on his steps, is on the left, where it's blue, you've got drivers. So you've got 6 drivers of leadership, which in the spider's web on the right are conscientiousness, achievement, drive, innovation, openness to feedback, helpfulness, and sociability. But you've also got 7 derailers, all of the weaknesses, all of the character flaws, which are approval-seeking, dependence, tension, rigidity, hostility, need to control, and competitiveness. Now, I actually disagree with Ron on competitiveness. I think competitiveness can fit in both, because I think if you're competitive as a team player, that could be really good as a leader. But if you're competing against individuals, that could be really bad as a leader. So you've got both going on, I think, in that level. So Ron's work is a really interesting, it doesn't do what lots of the personality trait models do and just go, hey, you're great. It says, well, yeah, okay, you might be great, but you've also got these derailers that we have to deal with. You've got these character flaws that we have to deal with, and you've got to be doing both. I also have a challenge with Ron's work. I don't think you should have used the word grit, because grit is just conscientiousness plus. It's not really a concept in itself. Now, if he got rid of grit and just put task mastery, then I'd be very happy. But hey, it's already published, so he probably won't. So again, this is one of the more interesting personality traits, where it's more complex and it's more accurate. I know Harvard have used it. I know Yale have used it. A whole bunch of big organizations have used it, but it doesn't make a big dent in the market, because all of the simplistic ones dominate. So when they're selecting for future leaders, Ron's work doesn't get anywhere. This one is the leadership circle. Some of you might have seen that before. It's another level of complexity. And again, you've got negatives and positives, complying negatives. You've got positives and you've got peaks and spikes. And but it's so many different levels of complexity of thinking. It's a really interesting model. But incredibly difficult to understand all of it and to teach people through all of it, and to use this kind of model as a without explaining it in depth. You have to spend so much time explaining it in depth to L&D teams and HR teams, and it's incredibly complex. It's very, very difficult to teach to. It's very useful, but it's very complex.
I know a lot of leadership consultants who use this and, swear by it, and have used other more simplistic tools prior, but it is quite involved and in depth. Yeah,
and I'm working with a group of people who use it, and it's really interesting. But yeah, it's difficult and complex, and a lot of people who work in the leadership development field will not be, they'll be using much more simplistic tasks. So worth having a look at. But also it includes negatives. It includes, you've got to build. You're going to find out, just like Ron's work, you're going to find out where your spikes are, both positively and negatively, and that becomes a very interesting model of the self and a model of the leadership
We've got about 5 minutes left.
Cool. I'll be quick. So what can we do is the big question, given that's where we are. So this is my own research. So we really think if you look at dramatic characters, the hero, like Superman, becomes pretty uninteresting, a blank cipher, where there's a motley cast of villains, fools, and tricksters. You have Alazons and blockers, so the people that stop success. There's 4 different types in classic literature. There's the heavy-handed father figure. So this is sort of the over-dominant boss who paternalism, this kind of stuff. The vainglorious soldier, the person who's the lieutenant who's taking all the glory on themselves. The learned crank, so this would be the academic who just goes, oh no, this is the answer, this is the answer. And the obsessed pedant, so anyone who just believes that their cultural values are incredible and nothing else can beat it. And then the Eirons, the facilitating tricksters. And so this is where I find it quite interesting. So on the left, you've got Jeeves, Sherlock Holmes, Puck and Ariel. So this is sort of, a bit slightly more classic variants of the trickster. So if you look at Jeeves and Worcester's the hero. Jeeves, he's the narrator. Sherlock Holmes, Watson's the narrator. They're secondary tricksters who make the plot happen. Well, modern Doctor Who, Columbo, the detective, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And to the right, Machiavelli, Cicero, and Socrates. So these are classic variants from some ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and the High Renaissance. So these characters, every leader needs these characters or part of these character traits. So that's ridiculous. I'm not going to tell my boss he should be more like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So we're looking at leadership in practice. So this is where I think we need to go. So most leadership is learned on the job rather than through leadership development programs. Great leadership most fully reveals itself in moments of extreme challenge when the team has to rely on each other's strengths and covers for each other's weaknesses. So this is what the All Blacks do when they play rugby. They work out who they're player against player. Are you better or worse than them? If you're better than them, right, how do we amplify your strengths? If you're worse than them, how do we cover for your weaknesses as a team? And if 25-year-old rugby players can do it, then 55-year-old executives should be able to do it. So in the VUCA world, leadership is a quality of the team, not of the individual, like the Avengers. And we must create our versions of the Avengers Tower, the Doctor's TARDIS, or Buffy's Library to enable this rapid development. So how do you get the group together and help them self-actualize and help them make decisions as a team and help them be clever and tricky almost. It's that trickster element. It's that witty trickster element. How do we do that within a team? So we build a superheroic environment. So psychological safety, I've talked about already. An environment where people can ask questions, admit mistakes, offer ideas, and challenge convention. Radical transparency, both strategic, okay, what are we talking about in terms of the strategic movement of the organization, and interpersonal, okay, what are your strengths and weaknesses, and be accountable and responsible for your strengths, but also recognize your weaknesses and ask the questions, but don't assume you know the answer. Collective intelligence, every brain contributes. Okay, it doesn't matter who you are within the organization, you might have the right idea. And we become learning agile so that we're also constantly developing in our people skills and our change skills and our self-awareness and our results, etc. Fully flexible environment in that we can work from home, we can work from the office, and we can work from the beach, and an effortless experience, and that all the technology works and we can just plug in and out, etc. So it's a huge environmental challenge. And the last slide, so I think if you've seen all 20 Avengers movies, the I Am Iron Man arc. So Tony Stark, when he first becomes Iron Man, he's in a conference and he's, again, brash and arrogant and egotistical. And he announces to the world, I am Iron Man. And he's not ready to be Iron Man. I think film number 2, he ends up heavy drinking to cope with the responsibility. And the last line he says when he clicks his fingers at the end of the Avengers 4 is, I am Iron Man. And that's the moment he becomes the mask. That's the moment that the figure he's trying to be, the leader he's trying to be, he actually actualizes. And that is because he's become part of a team rather than the Superman superhero. So we all need to become our own versions of Iron Man. We accept our weaknesses, we let others help us cope with them, and then we self-actualize and self-transform and become more than we think we can be. And if we get this right, then we can develop multiple leaders at speed rather than spending 20 years developing one person who might be able to be a useful leader. There we go. That was 5 minutes, I think.
That was excellent. Yes, you got us over the finish line quickly. Wow. I have lots of things going on for me, and I think more than anything, quite affirming for what I believe as well, particularly your statement around we need to build a superheroic environment. And I've been doing a lot of study of late of the blue zones and where, you know, areas around the world where there's more centenarians than anywhere else. And for the most part, they say it's not because of individuals having great habits and things themselves necessarily. It's because the environment supports them to do the right thing or the best thing for themselves. So their environment encourages them to move more, to eat well, to have great relationships. You know, in Okinawa in Japan, they're put into small social circles where they've got 5 or 6 friends from birth, and they literally meet with those people every week or every day for their entire life. So they have this tight-knit community and all those sorts of things. So again, it's about building the right environment for them, not necessarily an individual doing that. And it's all about their connectivity and what happens around them. So I can see how that could really, really support in a workplace or a country or a leadership style. I'm wondering if other people have questions or comments and want to jump in here right now and ask Richard something while we've still got 5 minutes for kind of Q&A. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat box. Ron's
Yeah,
360.
I know Simon. So yeah, I mean, and I agree. I mean, Ron is measuring personality traits, but within the leadership domain. And I agree. I mean, TLC is not evidence-based. At the moment, it's a model, an interesting model that has some kind of pragmatic use to it, because it's trying to explain wider dimensions of leadership. It's totally and utterly imperfect, but it's at least trying to push us into the right direction. And in thinking of it as a much more, it's an attempt to be a more complex understanding of leadership. It's flawed, but as they all are, all models are flawed, but some are useful. So I absolutely agree with what he said, but I still think we need to be searching for useful models that we can use in a useful way, even if they're not actually perfect.
Mm. And yeah, Simon said imperfect, but sometimes useful, yeah, for off the shelf. In the Facebook group, we've had someone, Liz Ross, who's been listening, and she's been hearting everything you're saying. She obviously really liked the presentation. And she's asked, what's your leadership style, Richard?
So I'm very lazy. I try and delegate as much as possible. No, I generally, I try and get people to at least self-actualize. So even if I think I know the answer, I'm not just going to come out and say, this is what we need to do. I will ask questions. So I try to create an environment where the person is given the opportunity to say what they think, and then we can have a critical discussion around it. I also, certainly when I teach, I take people to the point where they have a crisis. I can't deal with the amount of information you're throwing at me, and then I will handhold for a bit, and then they grow. And so that I try to go through that process in that. And if I teach, so MBA students, if I've not learned from them, then I've failed. So all of my MBA students should teach me something. If they're going to get a high distinction kind of mark, I would have learned from them as well. So that for me, it's that moment where we're both learning from each other that I try to get to. And then you make it, then the product, which in that is an MBA project, is incredible. And that's where I try to get to.
Which we were talking in one of the other presentations earlier this morning, trying to think whose it was, but we were talking about, it might have been last night with Peter Zing, who's a transhumanist, who was talking about AI and robotics and humans learning, through the process. And he talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and also going beyond just self-actualization, but actually helping others self-actualize, and that's our next step. I love your idea of making it faster and more, that we don't just have 2 or 3 people, moving through those ranks, but that we have more and faster. And I can remember Richard Branson saying once, show me a degree or an MBA that you can do in 3 or 6 months, and then I'm interested. Because he said by the time you get to year 3 or 4, the things you learn in year 1 have already moved on, because the world's moved on. What's your thoughts on that?
So I had an interesting challenge when I teach, because I am teaching leadership. So I have a problem if I teach leadership and they just follow the rubric. They're not showing leadership. So that I try to get them to the level of creating knowledge. Getting to that point where they're taking risks beyond the rubric, but doing it in a useful way, and not risks as in I'm going to fail my entire course by writing something out there, but I know how to create an argument, and I'm going to get to the point where I can go beyond that argument, the standard knowledge. So that's what I try to do, and I think any good master's level program at any level should do that. I would argue that obviously the university I work for does, but I would argue that lots of them don't. That even at master's level, it's too much just repeating back to what the professor thinks to them, and you get a good mark, rather than moving and beyond. So that's what I would. So to counter Branson's argument, if you've gone to the right school and you've learned how to create your own knowledge and your own ideas through the master's level training, then you're in a good place.
Right. You've learned how to learn. You've learned how to ask great questions.
Yes.
And to pick stuff up and look at it. I know we've got another comment there. I also remember meeting Mark Kelly once, who's an astronaut with NASA, and he talked a lot about, to avoid groupthink, how they created an environment where there was no pecking order, even though they had to when they were out of space, but decisions were made and they would ask the lowest ranked person first what they thought and how they would go around and decipher that. So again, it was about creating the right environment so that all voices got heard and there wasn't just the Superman in the group, so to speak. Someone's just said here before we jump off, wonderful talk. Jenny Lee, how do we evolve the models sooner rather than later, because we need more Avenger leaders right now? Yeah, because the wheels are turning slow. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a few conversations with a few different companies who are deeply, deeply frustrated about how leadership development is going on, and are looking for new models. The challenge that they have, the challenge to Jenny's question is, how do you break through the noise? You know, I've slowly broken through the noise to an extent over the last 5 to 6 years, but it's, you know, there's so much rubbish out there. There's so, you know, how do you actually, and partly sort of the next question, the idea of, or Simon's point, that you've created a narrative which uses characters leaders can identify with. Well, that's part of it, you know, using the Avengers as Superman and the Avengers. Most people have seen some of these films. And they can identify very quickly with the overall points and how quickly the Avengers came together and how rapidly they disperse again. And it's that speed of collectiveness and then the speed of dispersal. So it's rapid deployment teams to deal with specific problems. And if you can sell that to an organization, so it's partly the transparency of the, okay, this person can lead and this is their strength, this is their weakness, so we need to cover that weakness, and we need someone who can cover that, and then we've got another weakness. And so if you can do that at speed, and that's why I use Ron's work, because if you've got someone who's massively defensive as a leader, that spike of the defensiveness or hostility can totally destroy the team. So you need to know that. So some testing, and rapid deployment. I think you do 2 to 3 days of training. How do you create a psychological safe environment? How do you get to know each other? And then you deploy once you've gone through the identification process. So I think you can do it in a week. Identify, get them together, fast iteration. They learn, you find out what they've learned, you pull that back into the program, and then you go again. That's what I think, but persuading companies to do it is another matter entirely.
It takes courage and bravery.
Yeah.
Now, I know we've got to wrap up, and Michael's popped in there as well. What's a suggested reading list for mid-level managers? I don't know if you're in Facebook at all, Richard. Are you a Facebook user?
Unfortunately, I've got to go and have another meeting as soon as this finishes. But
yeah, so I was going to say maybe later you and I could share some information, and I can pop it in under the post in Facebook later.
Yeah, I mean, out of the books I'd suggested, I mean, both Heifetz and so Heifetz Leadership Without Easy Answers, and the Action Inquiry book by Talbot. They're not actually that difficult reads compared to the journal articles. So they're quite useful ways. There's an HBR article by Talbot, 7 Transformations of Leadership. That will be an interesting place to start.
Excellent. So I hope that answers your questions, everyone. Thanks, everyone. Thank you again, Richard, for joining us in the Superhuman Summit. See everyone tomorrow for day 3 for another round of about 7 amazing speakers. Bye for now, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.